Welcome back to my inner sanctum. I'm your hostess, Countess Elizabeth, mistress of the macabre. What lengths would you go to survive? How strong is your survival instinct? People don't really want to think of being in a position where they would have to eat their fellow man to survive. And I ask you, would you do the same if necessary? Today, we will discover a plane crash in the Andes and learn about what lengths the 1972 Uruguayan rugby team had to endure to ensure their survival. So, let's find shelter against the blasting winds and cook up a nice meal as we explore our grotesque curiosity. On October 13th, 1972, which also happened to be on a Friday the 13th, the Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 left the city of Mendoza, Argentina, carrying the Old Christians Rugby Club of Montevideo, Uruguay, to a scheduled game in Santiago, Chile. To get there, the plane would have to fly over snow-capped peaks of the Andes Mountains, and there were already signs that the flight wouldn't be easy. The pilot had made dozens of flights over the Andes, but his co-pilot, whom he would be training, and who would actually control the plane, hadn't. Weather conditions over the mountains had grounded planes shortly after it left Montevideo the day before, and as the plane crossed into the mountains, it was surrounded by dense clouds of mist. With visibility near zero, the pilot had to rely on instruments to get a sense of where he was. By mid-afternoon, the plane radioed the air traffic controllers in Santiago to tell them that he was almost to the town of Corico and was about to descend into Santiago. Relying on the pilot's report of his position, the tower granted permission to land, when in fact, the plane was nowhere near Santiago. The pilot had misread the instruments. Instead of descending towards the airport as he thought, he was on a collision course with a mountain ridge. As the plane neared the ridge, a sudden blast of wind knocked the plane into a temporary freefall of several hundred feet. The freefall brought them out of the clouds, and for the first time, the pilots could see what was in front of them. Unfortunately, all that was in front of the plane was a solid wall of rock. The pilot immediately pulled up and pushed the throttle down. The plane's nose rose up at the last moment, allowing the pilots to avoid the ridge. But the sudden maneuver caused the engine to lose power and the plane clipped the ridge. The crash tore off the right wing and ripped the fuselage in half. 5 people were lost with the tail section of the plane as it went tumbling down into the side of the mountain. The front end pitched down the opposite slope. Next, the left wing was ripped off. The wing's propeller immediately came loose, slicing through part of the fuselage. 2 more people were sucked through the hole at the back of the fuselage as the front of the plane slid down the mountain like a sled. The fuselage skidded down the slope for more than 2,000 feet before colliding with a snowbank. The force of the impact collapsed the cockpit like a soda can, killing one of the pilots. Several seats were ripped out of the plane and flew towards the front of the plane, with passengers still strapped in by their safety belts, killing several more. Out of the 45 passengers that set off from Montevideo, only 33 were still left alive after the crash. Many were critically injured. The rest were now trapped thousands of feet up in the Andes, where they were alive, at least for now. 2 of the rugby players on board, Gustavo Zarbino and Roberto Canesa, were medical students in Uruguay. They now used their training to help the injured passengers. Even just moments after the crash, they had to make difficult decisions. They couldn't help everyone. Many of the passengers had compound fractures or had been impaled by pieces of the plane. The men did everything they could, but as the sun set, temperatures dropped. Another 5 people died during the first night from their injuries. Meanwhile, when the plane didn't arrive in Santiago, the authorities in Chile were preparing a rescue effort. Planes were dispatched to look for survivors. Several of the planes even flew over the crash site. Survivors tried to signal the planes, but none could pick out the wreckage against the snow. Some of the survivors tried to spell out an SOS on the top of the fuselage with lipstick they found in the luggage, but they quickly realized they didn't have enough. They also found a small transistor radio in the plane, which they used to monitor the search efforts, though they couldn't use it to signal anyone that they were alive. The survivors spent the next few days constructing a crude shelter from the wreckage of the plane. There, they would have to endure the below zero temperatures. Already weak and injured, the weather proved fatal to many of those who were still alive. To make things worse, the amount of food they'd been able to scrounge from the wreckage was limited. They had candy bars and wine. Even with strict rationing, it wouldn't last them very long. As the days passed, and every attempt to attract the attention of the planes flying overhead failed, many began to worry that they'd never see home again. At first, some tried to survive by eating the leather from the plane seats. But on the 8th day, Some of the survivors made a pact. If they died, they decided that the others should eat their flesh to survive. The decision was a hard one. Many of the members of the Old Christians Rugby Club were deeply religious. The idea of eating the dead was only acceptable by viewing it as a type of communion. As Jesus had given his body up to be eaten by his disciples, the dead would now give up their body for the living. On the 9th day, some of the survivors gathered around the radio to hear the news that they'd been dreading. The search had been called off. With no signs of life, the rescuers had to decide to wait until the snow melted in the spring to look for the bodies instead. The news dampened the spirits of the survivors, but one man, Gustavo Nikolic, stuck his head inside the shelter and declared, "Good news! They called off the search." When one of the other survivors understandably asked why that was good news, Nikolic replied cheerfully, "Because it means we're gonna have to get out of here on our own." By now, most had come to accept the fact that they would only survive by eating the dead. Roberto Canessa took the lead. He didn't relish the idea of eating his friends, but he knew that without food, all of them would die, and like many of the survivors, he felt better knowing that his friends would have wanted them to do whatever it took to live. So using a piece of broken glass, they cut strips of flesh off the bodies and dried them in the sun. Canessa recounted, "I will never forget that first incision 9 days after the crash. We laid the thin strips of frozen flesh aside on a piece of sheet metal. Each one of us finally consumed our piece when we could bear to. Each one of us came to our own decision in our own time. And once we had done it, it was irreversible. It was our final goodbye to innocence." Canessa swallowed only a tiny piece of flesh. It wasn't a meal. It was an act of desperation. But his example gave the other survivors the strength they needed to do whatever it took to live. As the days went by, even this last food source began to give out. When the muscle was gone, they had to turn to the brains and organs of the dead. It was clear that even eating the bodies wouldn't be enough to keep them alive until they were finally found by rescuers. And starvation wasn't the only danger in the mountains. On October 29th, a massive avalanche swept through the shelter. The snow buried the survivors, killing 8 of them, using a metal pole. One of the men was able to poke enough holes in the snow to keep the others from suffocating, but they wouldn't be able to dig their way out of the snow for another 2 days. And when they did, they were greeted with a raging blizzard outside. It was now obvious to Canessa that waiting only meant death. Their one chance of survival was for someone to trek over the mountains and find help. The most physically fit members of the rugby club, including Canessa, decided to try their luck. The group set out from the crash site to explore the surrounding area, but after nearly freezing to death, they decided to return to the crash site. They then came up with the idea of making a sleeping bag from the insulation from the plane. The hope was that the bag would protect them from the freezing temperatures long enough to make it down the mountain. On December 12th, more than 2 months after the crash, 3 men, Canessa, Nando Parrado, and Antonio Benzinten, set out one final attempt to get help. They spent 10 days trekking through the deep snow and freezing cold as they made their way down the mountain. As the men gathered wood to build a fire, one of them saw 3 men on horseback at the other side of the river. Parrado called out to them, but the noise of the river made it impossible to communicate. One of the men across the river saw Parrado and Canessa and called back, "Tomorrow!" The next day, the man returned. Parrado scribbled a note, attached it and a pencil to some rock with some string, and threw the message across the river. Parrado's letter said, "I come from a plane that fell in the mountains. I am Uruguayan. We have been walking for 10 days. I have a wounded friend up there. In the plane there are still 14 injured people. We have to get out of here quickly and we don't know how. We don't have any food. We are weak. When are you going to come fetch us? Please. We cannot even walk. Where are we?" Sergio Catlan, a man who was present at the scene on the other side of the river, read the note and gave them a sign that he understood. Catlan talked with 2 other men. The farmers could not imagine that anybody would still be alive from the crash. Catlan threw bread to the men across the river. He then rode on horseback westward for 10 hours to get help. On December 22nd, more than 2 months after the crash, rescue helicopters arrived to pick up the survivors. Only 16 were alive, but their story soon became known as Miracle of the Andes, and eventually inspired the movie Alive. Well, that was a truly grotesque tale of survival and desperation. It really is a miracle that anyone survived at all, especially because not only had they had to survive a plane crash, but also an avalanche as well. It must have been an intense experience for those people who had to survive by eating the dead. Would you have done the same? I know I would. Thank you for watching the video. Subscribe, like, and share. If you would also like to keep exploring our grotesque curiosity, we will meet again in the darkness of the night.